Okay.
Good luck.
Thank you. Many years ago, I learned the following expression from a rabbi who said, "Before I begin to speak, I want to say a few words." So I want to say a few words before I speak. It is really a tremendous honor for me to be in your midst today, to be here in Tulsa. The plan was that it should have happened last year, and the COVID pandemic postponed things. But nevertheless, Nancy Pettis has just managed to do everything so well. One example I want to give you is she has arranged for someone who was born no more than 7 miles away from my home in Germany, in the middle Germany. So here's a young woman from Halle, the place that I want you to go to watch go to a zoo before World War II and then immediately after World War II. And this is the first time that I've met anyone in the United States who was born that close to my house. Yeah. I'm here today to talk to you about a time and people that was the evil that was done by them in the name of my homeland, in the name of my people, in the name of my church. So I'm talking to you about an affected, poisoned condition of life. And I want to tell you a little bit of how I got into that and how I got out of it. Or am in the process of getting out of it. 43 years ago, I was diagnosed with colorectal cancer. So I am a person in remission. And my next phrase is that I'm a child of a perpetrator. And I inherited in a manner that I can only describe like osmosis. I inherited through osmosis from a variety of sources the cancer of anti-Semitism. I'm an anti-Semite in remission, and I use that word on purpose. And in the course of my conversation, you will understand why I use that term in relation to anti-Semitism. I was born in 1935, and I think it's about 52 years ago, is that correct? I've begun to count backwards in my life now, yeah. And now the other honor that I have is that I'm celebrating my birthday tomorrow here in Tulsa. Wow. 86 years of my life. Nancy, you're a genius. Yeah. My spouse at home is also called Nancy. So there are 2 Nancys in my life now. So one of them is here. Yeah. I was born 6 weeks before or 7 weeks before the promulgation of the Nuremberg laws that we heard about today. And it is interesting, as I went through and heard the programs, that areas of my life were touched by others. By Dean McConnell, for example, she talked about Theresienstadt. My late sister Margaret's father-in-law was murdered in Theresienstadt. Not Jewish, he was an intellectual. And they were the very first one that the Nazis dealt with in Prague and took them out to the fortress in upstairs being put into town. And that's where he was murdered. And in Major Gunnell's presentation, and someone asked the question, why did they only take 18? Why not all the others? There were a number of more trials in Nuremberg done by the American Armed Forces. The first one was the international one, and then the others were done by the American forces, including one on German industry. And that affects my father's company, IG Farben. And my father was at that trial, but as a witness for one of the defendants. Even though it could have been highly possible that he also would have been accused. I remember the time in 1948 when he went to Nuremberg, and that particularly Mutti was very much concerned that they might just keep him and indict him as well. My father's job, assigned to him by Speer, the Vice Minister for Industry, as Germany expanded first westwards, all the chemical industries were to be incorporated into IG Farben. And then when they went to the east, when they took the Sudetenland in 1938, in the Sudetenland was a huge chemical factory, and that became the next target for my father's work, to incorporate them into his own company, which was simply a takeover with no money. And father had to make decisions. And he was involved in one of the decisions, although he didn't work at that place. The factory in Auschwitz, Monowitz, where IG Farben then built its largest factory for the production of what the war needed. The director of the construction project, and then the director when the factory was actually working, Mr. Walter Dilfeld, was in the IG trial in 1938 for 47-48. And he was indicted for his participation in the construction of that factory, which depended entirely on forced labor. By the way, I don't like the name slave labor, but I don't like the application of that word to what the industry was doing. When we think of slavery, we think of people for whom somebody else paid money so that you could buy them and bring them to your house. And then, of course, you would invest in them, that they would stay alive, so that you could get maximum production out of them before they did. Forced labor went exactly the opposite direction, particularly in Auschwitz, Monowitz. Very briefly, let me explain this to you. My father's company wanted to expand because Hitler had pushed them into a position where they had increased production tremendously. Synthetic rubber for tires, fuel for the car, gasoline, and medications. And the town where I was born was the place where the fuel and the synthetic rubber was produced. You mentioned your dad may have been working in Leuna or in Buna. Yeah? Hitler said, I want you to produce or increase your production. And the company decided that they would locate in an area where it was less likely or even unlikely that there could be bombing raids on that factory. So they were looking for a place. And the gentleman who did the exploration was a friend of my father's. I knew his family. And he comes back from his trip and he says there's a wonderful place in Poland, Auschwitz, where there's good rail connections, wonderful conditions for water, and the area is big enough that the factory can keep increasing. So IG Farben made the decision, my father was present to that decision, to locate and build a factory in Auschwitz. Auschwitz-Monowitz, like we have earlier, Auschwitz-Birkenau, were little Polish villages. They were totally eradicated, and Birkenau was built initially to house up to 100,000 prisoners of the Soviet Union. when Himmler got the job done, or was working on the job to build this prison camp, he heard of the decision by IG Farben that they wanted to build a factory in Auschwitz. He got in touch with IG Farben and told them, "You need workers, don't you? All the men in the German men were out in the army, so who are you going to get for your workforce? I've got it." And that's when the next move came, the final solution. Now, not a building camp for captured soldiers anymore, but now you're going to build a camp for the extermination of people. And he said, "I've got all kinds of them." And IG Farben signed an agreement with the SS that it would use the victims of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the SS demanded a certain price. And IG Farben made a decision: 4 marks for unskilled labor a day, 5 marks 50 for skilled labor a day. And my father's company paid the SS. And the SS became one of the richest military units in Germany because of IG Farben. So at first, IG Farben, the SS walked the working camp, the workers, from Birkenau to the construction site in Auschwitz. It is about a 5-mile walk. And by the time you've gotten up at 3 in the morning, have been to the Appellplatz to make sure that you were all around, and you got your lousy breakfast, you then walked 5 miles to work 10 hours a day. So very soon, IG Farben moved into what is called now the second selection. The first selection would happen in Birkenau, where you get off the trains, workers, kill them, etc., etc. My father's company set up a second selection because they wanted to make sure that they had able-bodied to build the factory and then run it and work in it. And the SS was hell-bent on getting as many people into the factory in order to make more money. Now, I mentioned earlier the director of that project. He was an almost next-door neighbor to us. I knew him, and now a little relief for a second. I knew their family very well, and one of their daughters was my age, and she went to the same school in the same class as I did. In those days, we had benches of separate units with a little inkwell. Many of you may remember what they looked like, those in the schools. And we had our stylos, and we would dip into ink, and then we would start writing. So I learned writing by hand. My handwriting was a stylo. And then I graduated to fountain pen. The daughter of the Dürfelds was sitting right in front of me, and she had wonderfully long, blonde pigtails. I sat right behind her, and one day, the ends of her braids were blue. And the ink in my little inkwell had gone down considerably. I'm telling you this because the relationship that my family had to the Dürfeld family was such that I could do this. And little Miss Dürfeld, when she found out, she just laughed. She knew what had happened. We were kind of buddies. But that form of intimacy is the one that I had to that family. And my father's colleague, Walter Dürfeld, was the director of that project in Monowitz. He was found and indicted, was found guilty by the American judges in 1948 and got the highest punishment, 8 years prison, which was lifted after 3 years by the High Commissioner of the United States in Germany, because by that time we had a cold war with the Russians, and they wanted German industry to be on our side, on this side. So Walter Dürfeld was released, and within a matter of 2 months, he was the director of one of the big companies in West Germany, aiding now in the Cold War effort. no longer the Nazis, but now the Cold War. I saw Walter Duffield, and then I'm going to stop talking about him in a second. I saw him one more time in my life, in 1958. We had, in 1953, we had emigrated from Europe to Canada, where I.G. Farman was setting up a factory again. During World War, between the two wars, they had factories in New Jersey. They wanted to be back in the United States. But Canada opened its borders to German industry a year ahead of the Americans. So we moved to Montreal. Dad's office in the following year was moved to New York, because then I.G. Farman could come to the US. And they had the administrative center on the 82nd floor of the Empire State Building. And when I went to visit him, I was surprised that one could open the windows and lean out. And if you wanted to, just give yourself a little push and you would have an 82-floor flight. It surprised me now that the security wouldn't allow that anymore now. But in Father's company, where then the whole floor was for the I.G. Farman. In that company, there were, I believe, as many as 8 or 9 judges who were Jews. And all of a sudden, my dad now has colleagues in his office who are Jewish, which he didn't have before. And I'll come back to that point a little later. I saw Walter Duffield in 1958 when I was the first time back to Germany, to Europe. And I was looking at him, and by that time I had a little bit of understanding of what Auschwitz stands for. And I looked into his eyes, and I was wondering, my goodness, what has those eyes seen? I couldn't answer very much of it. My studies at the university at McGill in Montreal was in order to prepare for ordination in the United Church of Canada. I was ordained in 1961, and I had won a fellowship to study in Europe. And I chose to go to Switzerland, to the city of Basel, where the theologian Karl Barth was still teaching. I became a student. And it was through him that I finally began to think, what did the churches do when they supported Hitler? Why were the German churches so keen on this guy? Why would theologians of renown, world renown, go up and say, God has given us a Führer. God is revealing to us through our Führer what this German destiny is to be. And they said that as ministers and theology professors. And I was wondering, how do academics get snared so easily? And that's why I began to ask questions. In my first year at McGill, I was in a class in mathematics, which, by the way, I failed horribly. In fact, I failed my whole first year. I wanted to study geology. I love the Canadian outdoors. And when I failed, I just dumped the G and put CH in its place. By that time, I'd become a candidate for ordination. In my class, we were arranged alphabetically. Next to me sat a really great guy, Norman. And he and I would play snooker. And between classes, we would run to the student union and play snooker. And one day, as he went around the table, he banged his knee against the leg of the table. And he said something to which I replied. I said, Norman, I didn't know that you spoke German. And he had a smile on his face. He said, Martin, that wasn't German. That was Yiddish. I'm 18 years old, and that is the first time in my life that I met someone who is Jewish. I really liked the guy. He was blonde, had blue eyes, didn't have a crooked nose. All the images that I had learned in Nazi Germany. I said, all those are lies. When I entered grade school in 1941, The teacher was a Nazi, and he was our teacher from grade 1 to grade 4. Oftentimes he would show up in his brown shirt with his swastika armband and oops, and the leather strap. Did I cut myself off the sound? And the leather strap. And he taught us, and this is what I meant by osmosis. He taught us everything that we needed to do and not do in relation to Jews. I don't know why he would tell 6-year-old boys and girls that they must never have girlfriends or boyfriends who are Jewish. Because, he said, and that I remember, he said, because if you do that, you're going to deteriorate German blood. I had no idea about the bees and the birds at that time, but he told us that kind of stuff. And here I am now faced by Norman, a wonderful fellow. And he said, "What are you going to do now, Martin?" I will never forget that experience, because that was the first time I heard from a Jewish person support. We corresponded. He went on to become a medical doctor, and I went on to become a minister. And Norman is some kind of guardian angel for me, continues to be. I don't know whether he's still alive or not. But that experience, that coming from outside of me, was a supportive statement, an additional person. So I speak now and go quickly into theological language. When I talk about reconciliation and redemption, I always talk about the mediators of resurrection and redemption. You can't achieve it on your own. That's my conviction. I can't believe it on my own. I need some mediators, and I want to tell you a little bit about some of them later on. Studied theology, got my Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Divinity, and later on I got 2 more degrees. So that because ultimately I wanted to teach, and most of my life I taught in theological faculties or schools. And I learned in preparation for my teaching and through contacts with various theologians and other human beings, other people, I learned about the churches, their involvement in Nazi Germany, in Nazism, and I learned about honored theological professors, whom I now can't even think of them without shuddering, that they were the ones who taught people to be ministers in Nazi Germany. And then gradually I had to begin to ask about my father. The stuff that I learned as a youngster is not so much that I learned anti-Semitism, but I learned about hate. And I'm going to tell you 2 incidents that happened during World War II of how and why I learned hate and why it became one of my strongest emotions. After I've told you those, I will also then tell you how I got rid of it. It is the year 1943. No, pardon me, let me jump forward quickly, one more item about my father. On the 22nd of June 1941, a Sunday morning, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. In my family, we had the habit that on Sunday mornings the whole family would gather, and my father would read from Scripture. He would lead us in prayer, and then we would sing a hymn. And then we had breakfast, and then we went to church. That morning he said, "No, I cannot do this today. because today Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. And then something very amazing happened. My father let fly with expletives, the like of which I would never hear again from him. But then he said, because the Russians are going to do to us exactly what they did to Napoleon. Just keep retreating further and further back into Russia. And then the winter will come, and then the supply lines are going to start breaking down, and then the army will starve, and then the Russians are just going to wait. And they waited long enough, and then of course they attacked Stalingrad, the worst battle in World War II, on Soviet soil. And the Russians won. And now I come to this event with my mother. The Russians won the battle, and then they captured a large number of German soldiers, and they brought them from Stalingrad to Moscow. And they marched them down on the road with Russians on both sides of the sidewalk, watching this parade or charade of German soldiers captured. I was in the kitchen with Mutti, and we heard the radio as a broadcast. And Mutti all of a sudden began to shriek, literally shriek. And finally she said that her brother Hans was among the German officers being now marched through Poland, through Moscow. And they were ridiculing or despising, at least that's what the announcer on the radio said. They were ridiculing our German soldiers and our German officers. And her shrieking is still in my ears. I was just about to be 8 years. And that experience is also deeply embedded in me. How my mother was injured or hurt. So I hated the Russians because of that experience with Mutti. A year later, the town of Leuna, where I was born and I grew up, where the big factory was. By the time of 1944, it came along that the Allied Air Forces could fly from England into that part of Germany. It's deep into Germany, almost halfway through, or more than halfway through Germany from west to east. They could fly on one tank of gas, as I put it, from England. The Flying Fortress, the B-17s, were the ones that were flown by the American Air Force, and they attacked during the daytime. And the British Air Forces, together with the Canadian Air Force, they were flying the Lancasters, the bombings, and they flew at night and attacked at night. On one day, now this is the daytime attack, the alarm system came late, so that we were really hard up to get to the air raid shelters. And by that time, the German Air Force was decimated sufficiently that they couldn't stop the attacks anymore on our town from the air. So Germany went into anti-aircraft defense, and one of these things was about 400 or 500 yards away from our house. So when the American bombers came, their bombing raids, they were accompanied by fighter planes whose task it was to take out these anti-aircraft positions. We were running, and then one of these American fighter planes was flying quite low. And we were trying to get into the, thank you, Nancy, we were trying to get into the bunker. And Mutti said, Martin, run. So I ran very quickly. She couldn't run that fast. And I stopped at the entrance to the air raid shelter. And I saw Mutti coming, and then there got this aircraft who had attacked the anti-aircraft position at first. Came around for another attack, but that's when he came upon us. And the pilot started firing the machine guns at us. I was at the entrance, and I could see Mutti running, and maybe the distance where the bullets were hitting is about this far from me from her. You could see when the bullet hit the ground. You could see the first studies in the University of New Hampshire. And Nancy had a house, and I, as a widower, was in that house, and I sold it to one of my children. I moved from Canada to Dover, New Hampshire. Nancy is a Quaker, and I would go with her on Sundays to the Friends meeting, silent Quaker meeting. But afterwards there was always time for conversations, and sometimes there was even some study stuff. I sat next to an old chap, Quaker, who on that particular Sunday was saying that how much he regretted as a Quaker. He was not a conscientious objector, but he had joined the American Air Force. And he said, for me that is now, I've become really a burden as a Quaker. I didn't stop. I participated in the war. And then I asked him, oh, what were you doing? Well, he said, I was flying air raids on Germany. I said, oh, where? And the way he pronounced it was Merseburg. That's even closer than between our house and your house. And I looked at him and he said, you dropped bombs on me. Because Merseburg, that he made attacking the factory when my father had initially been stationed. And here it is, the two of us were sitting together, we were worshiping God together, and he was the guy who dropped bombs on me. We were both just speechless for a while. But then he said, isn't that one of God's gifts to us, that we can become reconciled even in face of that? Okay, so I'm hating hating Americans and Russians. We're a little easier with the Canadians and the Brits. But I want to tell you how I got out of it. In 1952, we had for 3 years been living in Switzerland, in Lucerne. And the school where my older brother and I attended, the high school, had the system of classes in the morning and classes in the afternoon with a long enough break in between that we could jump on our bikes and go home for lunch. And Fritz and I got home one day and came to the kitchen where Mutti was sitting at the table crying, really crying, shaking. And we couldn't get a word out of her. So that finally Fritz got on the phone and called Father and said, Father, you better come home, there's something wrong with Mother. Father's office was a leisurely 10, 12-minute walk. He got there in 5 minutes, so he ran to be there, talked to Mutti, and finally, she stopped, and then she told us the following. This morning I went shopping, got on the bus, and 2 or 3 stops after I got on, the bus stopped again, and someone came in and sat next to me on the bus. And that woman then asked for directions for some place in Lucerne. And Mutti looked at her and tried to move away physically from her, where she had sat down. Well, you know, on a bus, you can't move very far away, but far enough away that the woman noticed that Mutti wanted to push away. She thanked Mutti for the information and then said to her, I noticed that you wanted to move away from me. Why? Mutti said, you're an American, aren't you? Yes, that's why. I'm convinced to this day that God had a special mission for the American woman, because she asked, please tell me why you're not like Americans. And Mutti said, one of your boys shot and killed my firstborn son. Eberhard was barely 16 when he volunteered. He'd been in the Hitler Youth from age 10, so he'd been there 6 years, and he really was indoctrinated. And the message of one of the guys who was tried in Nuremberg that we heard about earlier the name of that man, the leader for the youth, had really gotten to my brother. I remember the last words I heard from him was in November 44, when he volunteered. And Father, would you want to talk him out of it? And he said, no, I cannot now forsake my Führer. That's how hooked he was. So he volunteered. And he became involved in the largest encounter between the German forces and the American forces on German ground, near Leipzig. And a sniper, an American sniper, killed Eberhard. I have at home his military passport. And the bullet went right through it, into his heart. So the sniper was a very good shooter. Yeah. And what he said, one of your boys, she said that to the American woman, one of your boys killed my firstborn son. And the American woman replied and said, one of your boys killed my firstborn son. Two mothers, same fate. And what he said, when did your son die? On the 22nd of April, 1945. Which is the date of my brother Eberhard's tombstone, April 22nd, 1945. And the American woman said, and where did your boy die? Well, folks, guess where the boy died? On the same battlefield. I get goosebumps telling you this. The two mothers at that moment embraced each other and began to cry on each other's shoulders, so that some of the passengers on the bus were wondering what was wrong with those two women. But those two women in that particular moment had been freed from believing any of the bullshit that propaganda on both sides gives us in an effort to go to war. The lies and the stuff, they just put that aside and they recognize here are two mourning mothers. And at that point, when he had finished telling, I stopped hating the Americans. I think she too was one of God's angels, because she kept asking, pushing Mutti to talk. And Mutti found a way to her as she found to her, to Mutti. That's how I stopped hating Americans. I'm glad to tell you that. Now, how about the Russians, the Soviets? I was ordained in 1961, and in 1970, I accepted the teaching position. No, in 75, I accepted the teaching position in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, at the Divinity School. And I had been asked in the next year, 1966, 76 or 77, I've forgotten which year it was, to be the preacher at the ordination of one of our students. And I went to Newfoundland to be with the annual meeting at which the ordination was to take place. Now here are all these ministers together, and I remember a phrase from another gathering I went to in Manitoba in the summer for ministers' meetings. And all the ministers were in the same place, and the elder of the congregation, the clerk of session, said, you know something, you ministers? When you're all together in one pile, you really stink like manure. It's better that you be spread out all over the country, then you can do good. Well, anyhow, I was in one of these manure piles. And there was a devotional speaker, and for his topics, he said, I want to talk about faith, hope, and love. And on the day when he was talking about love, I was together with the audience. And he told a story that he said, I'm reading quite a lot, and I'm reading a book by a fellow called Evgeny Yevtushenko. When I first visited Hank here in Tulsa, in the last millennium sometime it was, he showed me the house where Yevtushenko used to live here in this town. Unfortunately, he wasn't there. I would have loved because of the story that this man was telling us in Newfoundland. He said, I'm reading this book, a precocious autobiography, where Yevtushenko describes the first time he entered the city of Moscow. He had been placed with his grandmother to look after him during the war, because the father and mother were engaged in fighting. And the grandmother said, now we need to go shopping and we need to go into town. So they walked into Moscow, or wherever they were going to do their shopping. And they came upon a street on which people were lined on both sides, waiting to go on. And old men, the ones who were not able to fight anymore, were trying to hold the crowds back. And when they got there, they saw a column of German soldiers being marched through the streets. That was the event in 1943 that I remembered at that point. And at first the German officers directed, showing how good stuff the German soldiers are. And then the others, the rest of the soldiers, many of them badly wounded or barely able to walk. And all of a sudden, near Yevtushenko, an old grandmother, babushka, I like that word for grandmas. When the babushka pushed through the guys holding her back and walked up to one of the German soldiers, reached in her pocket and gave him a piece of bread. And that was a signal to the other babushkas to do the same. And when he was telling us that story, I stopped hating Russians because of these wonderful babushkas. So when the speaker had finished, I stood up and said, "Sir," and then I told him the story about how my uncle was in that crowd, and that maybe he was a recipient. And he said, "You see, I told you folks, I wanted to tell you something about love that it can move mountains. Well, we have an illustration now." I sat down crying. Behind me sat a Newfoundland fisherman, a giant of a man. He put his hands on my shoulder with a grip like a vice grip. And he said, "Mr. Chairman, I ask that we stand for a minute of silence for that man's uncle." I stood up and he said, "I want to tell you, I'm in the territory of my former enemies. You were all my enemies," I said. "And here is one of you who is asking that we stand in memory of one of his enemies." That kind of stuff enabled me then finally to begin asking the question, what about my father and his involvement in the industry? And I began to read, and then eventually, by this time I'm now a father of 3 children. Barbara, my late wife, of present memory, we would visit my parents quite often. We lived only about 50 miles away from each other. They were on Lake Erie and I was in Windsor, Ontario. We got together quite often. And then one morning, Munti said to me, "Martin, you must stop asking these questions of Father, because he is afraid that you are going to betray him." Not betray, what was the word she used? Anyway, he is afraid that you're going to judge him. I went up to Father's office immediately upstairs and said, "Dad, I'm not going to judge you. But I want to know, I am your son, I want to know what of the values that I have that you taught me. What are they? Who am I? And what is it that I've received from you?" And so we would talk, and he repeated, "Martin, you always ask, what do you know? We Germans didn't know anything." Well, I had heard that up to here. we didn't know. And then I asked him, I said, Father, I had just recently heard this sentence from a German theologian, and I love it. And I said to him, I said it in German, but for your benefit, I will use my foreign language, not my mother language. I said to him, during the war, Germans knew as much or as little as they wanted to know. What they did not know, they didn't want to know. But they knew enough to know that they didn't want to know any more. He blew his stack, which to me was an illustration that my father knew. He said, one more question like that and our relationship is finished. I gave him a promise. I said, Father, I will never ask any more questions of you. What I didn't say to him, but I said it to myself under my breath, I will ask questions elsewhere. And then I began to ask the questions about IG farming industry. I want to be brief on this because I want to tell you how all these things got resolved. IG Farm built this factory. It was, as I mentioned to you, not slave labor, but forced labor. And they worked out in the office of the director Dürfeld, in the office, how much you need to feed a forced laborer in order for him and for her to be able to work at very hard labor for 10 days or 10 hours a day, winter or summer. And they figured out if you calorie count between 1,400 and 1,500 calories a day. If you want to picture what that is, it is about 5, 6 or 5, almost the whole Big Mac. And then when in 1944, when the influx of Hungarian Jews and from the other Jews from the Balkans to Auschwitz became so large, the SS told Father's company, told Dürfeld, you can reduce the number of calories, keep them alive for 2 weeks, and they cut the calorie intake to 800 a day. Finally, IG Farm decided we are not going to get these guys from Birkenau walking. We're going to have to bring them by car because they're exhausted. So they did. The SS agreed, and then IG Farm said it's even better that they don't come from a distance anyway. We will build our own concentration camp. A private company on the stock market, yes, a private company built with the cooperation of the SS, a privately owned concentration extermination camp. That's my father's company, of which he said we didn't know. I was going to ask him one day, look, your office was relocated, it was put, you were working from Paris, the industries in Belgium, Holland, and France. Your office was in Paris. The Sea wasn't that very far away from where your office was. This was a gathering place of Jews for shipping them east. And when the trains came from the east, they brought workers so that the factories in the west could make use of them. You must have known about those. But I didn't ask him that. But I found out later on, yes, of course. They brought workers from the east and shipped Jews to the west, shipped them to the east to work in Auschwitz-Birkenau. But that I found all that out later. And then the way I see it, figure this out when they say we didn't know, is if you rejected resistance, Most Germans rejected resistance. Father would have rejected it, I'm sure. The only option that you could choose is to not ask any questions, to know nothing. So when Father told me we didn't know, what he is saying is we made the decision not to find out, lest we get into trouble. And now this is the one from whom I have my values, from him and from Uti. So Germans are, I call them away lookers. Yeah. And away lookers is again one of the decisions you make. You don't want to see it. But you know what it is. That's why you don't want to see it. That remained unresolved. My father paid for the education, my university education of all three of my children. Mind you, these are Canadian university fees, and what is more customary here in the United States. But still, he paid for their education. I learned from him all sorts of things that are valuable in my life. Cameras, for example, taking pictures. I took 2 trips with him, one year, one in 58 and one in 61, when I was in Europe. He was then working in Lisbon, in Portugal. I took 3-day trips with him, all alone. And those were wonderful trips. We could exchange. But there was one topic we didn't touch. Except on the first trip, I raised it briefly, namely Auschwitz. And he said, that trial in Frankfurt was nothing but victor's justice. And I got enough of a hit. Dropped the subject, Martin. That was not victor's justice. I mean, the presentation of Major Gunnell was so very, very clear by outlining what they decided to go through. Much of it I didn't know. I think, anyway. Now, how did I get out of all this? My father died in 1991. He's buried in Montreal, next to Otis, next to my mother. And I had seen a film, you may know it, it's called Weapons of the Spirit, by a Jewish person who now lives in California, and he actually made the film, Weapons of the Spirit. He was born to Jewish parents who had been given sanctuary or protection in a region in the Loire, the Haute-Loire region. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon is the name of the town. The farmer's family had given the parents refuge and hiding, and he was born there. And he wanted to make this film and went back. The parents were gone. I think the mother and father both had died, but the daughter, she was a little girl when he was born, and they played together. And at one point, the young woman says, my great hope is that we can be a worthy example of the dignity of our parents, and that I can be in some ways a little bit like him. I can't say that of my father. I can't say that I would like to be like him. I want my children to be able to say that of me. But that's stuck in my craw. I can't relate to my father like this. I decided that I wanted to go and see Auschwitz. And I have a friend now who works for the Auschwitz Museum, Teresa Untitled. Do you know her? I'm in love with her. Because when I said to her, I would like to see the Gunnell because I know the factory doesn't exist anymore. She said, no, the factory exists. It is now giving job to many people here in Poland, including my husband. I said, wow, how wonderful, what a wonderful divine judgment. Here's a factory that swallowed lives, that exterminated human beings through labor, that now provides life and income So I decided I wanted to go to Auschwitz. And I was talking to a Canadian colleague, and I said to her, you know, I have to go to that place. And she said, I want to go too. So we decided the next year, that was 1994, we would go to Europe together and go to Auschwitz. Well, we did. We arrived at Krakow and found a hotel. And in the evening, we went down for a glass of wine at the bar and were talking. When the man behind us got up and came over and he said, I've heard you speaking. Do you by any chance want to see the camps? He said, yes. He said, look, I own my own taxi. And if you like, I'm totally at your disposal. $80 a day. Marilyn and I jumped at the chance and we took it. And then in the morning he met us and he drove us to Auschwitz Camp No. 1, the former Polish army barracks. And when we arrived at the gate, we said, fine. Marilyn and I had decided we didn't want to join any other group. We just wanted to be alone by ourselves. But all of a sudden she said, Martin, I can't go in there. I simply cannot. Arbeit macht frei. The way I interpret that, by the way, is, yeah, it makes you free because it turns you into smoke that goes up. Or freedom. She said, I can't go. And I talked to her for about 10-15 minutes. And we finally decided, all right, let's go in after all. I took her hand, we walked in together, but soon separated because again we did want to be completely unaffected by something outside in order to focus on what we were seeing. We had agreed to meet again in 3 or 4 hours, or whatever time it was, and we met again. Took the cab and drove us to Auschwitz, to Bergen now. And then we went in, and the first experience for me of walking on the ramps when the trains were going in. Typically German fashion, you have one track going in and then you go split for 5 separate tracks. And then I could, from seeing the films, I could hear the barking of the German dogs and the yelling of the officers and the cries and the fear of the inmates. After about an hour and a half we walked, we stayed together then. We stayed together after we came to what I still don't quite understand why this area in Auschwitz II is called Canada. But here were these 2 Canadians now being there. And as we were walking out, I said to her, Marilyn, I can't go back over the ramps. I cannot go back through that tower again. I can't. She said, look, Martin, over there, there's a ditch. And we can go into the ditch under the fence and come out on the other side. We did. Marilyn went down, jumped down first. She said to me, come, Martin, give me your hand. She to help me get down. And then under the fence, and then she climbed up on the other side and said, give me your hand, Martin. I pulled you up. She did. Marilyn, my friend, is Jewish. And I, as a German male, took her into Auschwitz. And she, the Canadian woman, took me, the German, out of the camp. If I want to use a metaphor for resurrection, that's it. And then 12 years later, in 2016, a group of Holocaust scholars to which I belong, we meet every 2 years in a wonderful place in England, over there. We had made the decision that we were going to go to Auschwitz, as many of us as could. And we did. We flew from England, flew to Krakow. Auschwitz has a wonderful guest center, and we were housed in that place and fed in that place. We went to the camp, and Teresa, this woman who works in the museum, was our guide. She's part of that Roxton group. And we came to camp number 1, and then we came to the place where you showed it in your film presentation, the wall where the executions took place, where you had placed all these flowers and candles. When we got there, in our group, I would say at least a dozen Jewish members, they all went on their knees, knelt down, took out little candles, placed them there and lit them, and recited the Kaddish. When one of them got up, she came to me, put her arm around my shoulders, and said, "Martin, come join us. You are one of us." Her name is Rachel. A woman says to a man, an American says to a German, a Jew says to a follower of Jesus. I don't like to call myself Christian anymore. I want to be more direct, disciple, follower of Jesus. To get some distance between me and the church, the historic Christian church. She said this to me. And again, that is redemption. That's reconciliation. And now now you can understand why I talk about the mediation that has to take place. Certain things we cannot do on our own. We need a mediator to be able to bring it to us and then help sustain us. So I have these three angels, Marilyn, Rachel, Nancy. And now I began talking about colorectal cancer. Now I'm going to talk briefly about my heart and then I'm going to stop. On the 29th of April this year, my cardiologist equipped me with a pacemaker. And I've developed a very close relationship to him. Mark Jacobs is his name. Mark I. Jacobs. And we had developed a really quite close personal relationship. So I asked Mark, tell me, what does the I stand for? He said, Israel. I didn't know he was Jewish. Again, he doesn't have a big nose like this. He doesn't lie. He has blue eyes. And he's trustworthy. I trust him entirely with my condition. And then out of the blue one day, maybe about a year, 2 years ago, he asked, are you ever going to go back to Auschwitz again? I said, you know, Mark, I think I would like to go one more time to tie up some loose things and I'd like to go. He said, Martin, again, this is a Jew speaking to me as a former German, native German. He said, Martin, I want you to take me to Auschwitz. So we were planning to go in May this year, or last year. Virus gummed it up, but now we've begun to talk again. And I think now I'm able to go without fear, because I have a Jewish hand next to me that I can hold. My final sentence, but if there's time for questions, my final sentence is just going to be this. As a theologian, as a teacher, now retired, I wished I could have at least 40 more years in my life to fix the anti-Judaism of the Christian church. Because 1,900 years of anti-Judaism is one of the most productive resources for anti-Semitism and for violence. And I pray that there will be a day one day when the state of Israel can truly be free from violence. Friends, thank you for your